45 at 80, I broke an Amish rule about my body. No one had explained why it existed. The paper made a sound I had never heard before. It crinkled when I sat down, thin, loud, almost indecent, in the way that paper had no business being that loud in a quiet room. The light above me hummed, not the soft hum of a lamp, but something harder, more insistent, the way a machine hums when it has no patience for stillness. The air tasted like nothing, clean in a way that felt wrong because clean things, where I came from, always had a smell. Pine, soap, bread, cold morning. This clean had no memory in it. I folded my hands in my lap, the way I had folded them for 80 years, and I waited. My name is Sarah, and this is Amish Aunt, a place where I share the stories that took me a lifetime to find words for. If you're new here, I'd love for you to subscribe, and I want to ask you something before we go further. Is there a rule in your life you have always followed, without ever knowing why? Leave it in the comments. I want to know. Was 80 years old the first time I sat in a room like that alone. No husband beside me, no sister. No daughter-in-law with her hands folded the same way mine were folded. That particular posture we all learned without being taught. Hands nested in the lap, quiet, still, taking up the least possible space. I had been taking up the least possible space my whole life. It was not something I resented, not then, not exactly. It was simply the shape of me, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it. I had been held a certain way for so long that I had forgotten water could move on its own. That morning at 80, I was remembering. I'm not going to tell you yet what I was there for. Not because I want to be mysterious, but because the what mattered less, in the end, than the why it had taken 80 years to get there. That is the story, not the thing itself, the waiting, the enormous, ordinary, unremarkable waiting that I had spent my entire life inside without once recognizing it as waiting. I had thought it was living. I had thought the silence was sacred. I want to tell you how a woman can spend 8 decades believing that, genuinely believing it, with her whole heart, and only understand the difference on a Tuesday morning, under fluorescent light, with paper crinkling beneath her. I grew up knowing my body was not entirely mine. That is not a dark thing to say. In my community, it was simply true, and it was said plainly, gently. Your body belongs to God first, then to your husband when you married, then to your children when they came, then to the community, in your work and your presence and your witness. You were never asked to be ashamed of it. You were simply asked, always quietly, firmly asked to hold it carefully, to cover it, to offer it to its proper purposes, and not to linger over it, not to examine it too closely, not to give it more attention than it needed. A vessel does not polish itself. My mother taught me this the way she taught me everything, not with a lecture but with her hands. I remember being 7 years old, maybe 8, and she was adjusting my cap before church, her fingers quick and certain at the back of my head. I had turned to look at myself in the small mirror we kept near the door, just for a moment, the way children do. She didn't scold me. She simply turned me back around, smoothed the strings of my cap, and said, Mir sot net of unsauergach. We should not look too much at ourselves. It was not a prohibition. It was a posture, a whole way of moving through the world, pressed into me with her thumbs before I was old enough to ask what it meant. The word for it in our tradition is Gelassenheit. I will not explain it to you the way a book would explain it, because a book has never worn it. Gelassenheit is yielding. It is the deliberate practice of setting down your own will and your own wants and your own loud, insistent self, and choosing instead the quieter thing, the community, the church, God's order as the bishop understood it. It is beautiful, genuinely beautiful, when it is lived well. I want you to know that, want to tell you that a life shaped by Gelassenheit can be full and warm and held. I lived that life. I loved that life. And I also want to tell you what it cost. Not all at once, but slowly, the way water hollows stone. Not the water's fault, not the stone's, just the long pressure of time. There is a particular kind of rule that has no name. Not in the Ordnung, the body of Amish church tradition that shapes everything from the hem of a dress to the width of a buggy wheel. Not in any bishop's letter, not in any scripture passage that anyone ever read aloud at the table. It lived somewhere else entirely, in the spaces between those things, in what was never said, never asked, never offered as an option. In my community, there was an understanding about women's bodies and the gaze of medicine, about what a woman should allow and what she should not. It was not cruel in its intention. It was simply never questioned. Rules that are written can be debated. Rules that are only ever felt. Those are the ones that last. I was 44 years old, the first time my body asked for something I could not give myself. Something shifted inside, the way things shift when they have been patient long enough. I told my husband. He prayed. I told my mother. She made a tincture of something. I don't remember what. I never learned the names properly. And she brought it to me in a small jar with a cloth tied over the top. The women in our community had their own medicine, their own knowing passed down in jars and in whispers. And for most things it was enough. For most things I waited, I prayed. The thing resolved on its own, or seemed to. I'd not ask if a doctor could have told me what it was. The thought arrived once quietly, and I set it down. That was what we did. We set things down. I remember asking my mother once, only once, a question that had been sitting in me for a long time. We were snapping beans at the table together, the two of us, the afternoon light coming in at that low angle it gets in October. I said it carefully. The way you say things when you already know the answer might not come. Why don't we? And I didn't even finish. She looked at me for a moment. Not unkindly, then she said, Das ist nicht unser Weg, that is not our way, not God's way, not the bishop's instruction, just our way. I nodded. I snapped another bean. I was 46 years old, and I filed that answer in a place inside me where I kept the other things I had set down. What I didn't know then was that the pile was still growing. The morning I finally went, I did not announce it. I did not pray over it the night before, did not ask for permission or guidance or a sign. I simply woke at 5, the way I had woken at 5 for 60 years, and I made my decision the way you make a decision when you have waited so long that the waiting itself has become the thing you are most tired of. I called my neighbor Carol from the phone shanty at the edge of our property. Carol, who had been driving me to town for small errands for 11 years, who never asked more than she needed to, who had a warm car and a quiet way about her. I said I needed a ride. She said what time. That was all. I went back inside, made the oatmeal, fed the cat, and sat at the kitchen table until it was time. The drive took 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on Carol's dashboard the whole way, not because I was anxious, but because I needed something to hold on to, something that moved in a direction I could follow. The fields outside were pale and frost-edged. It was early March, the ugliest month, the one that can't decide what it wants to be. I watched them pass. I thought of Ruth. Ruth had been my neighbor for 31 years, 5 years older than me, a woman who made the best apple butter in 4 counties, and who laughed with her whole face, and who had developed something in her 70s that the women talked about only in the vaguest terms, the way we talked about all body things, sideways, quietly. In the language of she's not been well, Ruth prayed. Ruth waited. Ruth died on a Wednesday in November, 3 years before that drive. The doctors, when her family finally brought her in, said it had been there a long time. Said it was the kind of thing that found earlier could have been managed. I had thought about Ruth every day since. The clinic waiting room had a logo on the wall in bright blue and green, the kind of colors that feel like they are trying to reassure you, which only made me more aware that reassurance was needed. A woman at the desk asked me questions I had never been asked in that order before. Date of birth, insurance, emergency contact, allergies. I did not have insurance. I paid in cash, an envelope I had been quietly setting aside for 4 months. When she asked for an emergency contact, I gave Carol's name. I had not told my son. I had not told my daughter-in-law. I had folded this errand into myself the same way I had folded everything else, quietly, taking up the least possible space. Except this time, the folding was my own choice, not the community's. There is a difference. I was only beginning to understand how large that difference was. They gave me a gown. Paper again. Everything in that place was paper, as if the whole world was temporary, and they wanted you to know it. I put it on in a small room with a curtain instead of a door, and I sat on the edge of the table, and the paper crinkled again. The same sound from the morning. and I realized I had been hearing that sound in my mind for weeks without knowing what it was, an anticipation my body held before my mind caught up. The nurse was kind in a brisk way, a practiced kindness, and she did not look at me the way I had feared, not with pity, not with the mild confusion some English people show when they see the cap and the plain dress. She simply looked at me the way you look at a person. That, too, was something I had not expected to be so disarming. I will not tell you the details of the examination itself, not because they were terrible, they were not, but because the details are not the story. What I will tell you is this: when it was over, when I was sitting up again and the doctor, a woman, perhaps 50, with steady hands and a calm way of speaking, had told me what she found, which was a thing that was real and present and treatable, something that had been growing in the dark of my body for perhaps 2 years without my knowing. She asked if I had any questions, and I had one. I had carried it for 40 years inside the answer to a different question. I said, "Can you tell me why? Why would a woman be told in her community never to come somewhere like this? Why would that be a rule?" She was quiet for a moment, a real quiet, not a polite one. Then she said, "I don't know. I honestly don't know. I sat with that for a long time. I'm still sitting with it, if I am honest." There was no bishop's letter, I asked later, carefully, indirectly, the way you ask things in a community where the asking itself can become a report. There was no founding instruction, no scripture passage anyone could point to, no moment when a church elder had stood up and said, "This is forbidden." The rule had no birth. It had only momentum, the momentum of a thing that has been true so long it becomes invisible, becomes air, becomes the color of the sky. Gelassenheit had taught me to yield my body to God's order, but somewhere along the long road of generations, a community's discomfort with women and medicine and the private interior of a woman's body had been placed inside that word quietly, without announcement, and no one had ever taken it back out. The yielding and the rule had grown together until they looked like one thing. They were not one thing. I want to tell you what I did not feel because I think it matters. I did not feel rage. I did not feel that my community had wronged me with intention, that the women who came before me had been wicked or careless or cruel. My mother set down what her mother handed her. Her mother set down what was handed to her. Harm does not require malice. It only requires enough generations of silence, and I also want to tell you this, because both things are true, and I will not let one swallow the other. I loved my life. I love my community. The women who quilted beside me, and the men who helped build each other's barns, and the children who learned their first songs from the Ausbund. And the way a Sunday morning feels when 300 people you have known your entire life are breathing the same prayer at the same time, that is real. That is beautiful. That beauty and this harm lived in the same house. I am old enough now to hold them both without dropping either one. I went home that afternoon. Carol dropped me at the end of the drive, and I walked the rest of the way through the cold, past the garden that was still mostly mud, past the place where the old apple tree had stood before the storm took it 2 winters ago. I hung my cap on its hook inside the door. I started supper. My son came by at 6 and I fed him, and we talked about ordinary things, the fence post that needed setting, the letter from his daughter in Ohio. I did not tell him where I had been. Maybe I will one day, in the careful way I tell things. The treatment began the following week. They caught it. I am still here, and I am still Amish. I did not leave. I did not need to leave. I only needed to ask one question that had been waiting 40 years for a mouth willing to say it out loud. I think about Ruth. Not every day now. The grief has changed shape. The way grief does when you've carried it long enough. It has become something quieter, something that sits in the corner of a room rather than in the center of it. I think of her apple butter and her laugh and her hands that were always moving, always making something. I think of the questions she never asked. And I think, I don't say this with bitterness, I say it with the plain sadness of a woman who knows what she knows. I think she deserved to ask it. I think she deserved an answer. We all did. If you are listening to this and there is a rule living in your life, a rule about your body, about what you are allowed to know, allowed to feel, allowed to ask, I want you to do something I did not do until I was 80 years old. I want you to ask where it came from, not in anger, just honestly. Ask it the way you'd ask about the weather, the way you'd ask about any ordinary thing. Why does this rule exist? Who made it? What does it serve? Because I found out at 80, sitting in a paper gown under a humming light, that some rules have no answer, and a rule with no answer is not a rule from God. It is just a silence that learned to speak with authority. My hands rest differently now. I noticed it first about a week after I came home, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening, the lamp on, the house quiet, my hands in my lap, the way they have always been, but not folded, just resting, open. It is a small thing, perhaps the smallest thing, but I had folded my hands for 80 years and now they were open. And the difference between those two things, I think that is the whole story.